We all ready? All right. I know. It's exciting. All right. So again, thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. This is the annual testing report. As Dr. Mingle said, you'll have opportunities to see our data from 2019. You'll also see some longitudinal data within the report, but that tends to be localized data. So I'll talk you through that as we go through the presentation, and we'll look to do a second presentation as we did in past years. The topics I really want to talk about tonight, though, is just an overview of the administration last year, because if you remember, it was a change in the way we did testing within the district. The state had actually made some adjustments, so I just want to remind everybody about that. Again, just talk to you about the scoring of the assessment itself, just to remind everybody how that works as well, especially if you don't have students in those grades. I think it's important to kind of recognize what the scaling looks like on that and what the leveling looks like on that. We do have a couple other assessments that we administer that are state-driven assessments. I just want to make mention of those and talk to you a little bit about those as well. And then we'll really get into just a lot of different views of sometimes the same information but presented across a series of slides, because a lot of these slides are actually provided by the state. The state recommends that these are the types of information that should be provided to the boards of education, so you can see this. So a lot of you have seen some of this information in different contexts and some of the information that was already shared to you, but you haven't seen it with some of the comparison data from the state that they provided so far. And I just want to talk a little bit about things that we're doing proactively within the district to kind of zoom in a little bit on just some of the professional learning that's taken place and the efforts that we've made over the past few years with that. And then also give information about the 2020 assessment. So unlike Billy's slide serial, mine is about 40 slides. So I'll just, again, ask your patience as we're going through all these different slides and trying to work our way through that. All right, so remember, last year was the first year that we did NJSLA. We did PARC for a number of years before that. So, the state transitioned last year, moving themselves out of the PARC consortium. So we don't compare ourselves to any of the other states that used to also use the PARC assessment. The platform of the assessment stayed the same. So it was a digital assessment done in the Pearson platform again. But there were changes again to the number of items, the number of sessions and units that students experienced, and the amount of time that students spent on those units. So there were some fairly dramatic changes with that. And I think it's important to just recognize that even though we're comparing NJSLA data to PARC data, the assessment did change. So, it is one of those things that we have to kind of keep that in the back of our minds when we're kind of looking at some of that information in terms of comparison information. Students in grades 3 through 8 took the assessment just like they did with PARC. So they took that in ELA and mathematics. And then also remember, we have end-of-course assessments for high school courses that we're teaching here at the middle school. So we have a lot of students that take the algebra end-of-course assessment, and we have a smaller cohort of students that take the end-of-course geometry assessment. We did have students last year in grades 5 and 8 take NJSLA for science. We do not receive scoring reports for that this year. Even though we went through the whole assessment last year, the state is using that assessment as kind of a scale-setting baseline year. They're not sharing any information back to districts about how students did relative to that assessment, so they're using that to kind of set up the baseline scoring that's going to be applied to this year's assessment. So, just sharing that up front so everybody's aware of that as we look at that. I want to talk about two assessments that we do administer in the district. We don't talk a lot about these oftentimes, but it's important that you just recognize that these take place. One is called a DLM, which is a Dynamic Learning Maps Assessment. This is really done for a very, very small cohort of students, and it's typically under, I think this year was under 5 students that took the DLM. There are students with such unique needs that they can't access NJSLA, but federal law and state law still requires that we have an assessment of these students at different levels. So that group of students that takes the DLM has a very different kind of assessment profile, a very different set of work that takes place. But it is the type of thing I just want you to be aware that is something that's typically accessed through an IEP. It is something, again, that for those students would be the least restrictive testing environment that would take place. We would not report on those students typically because, again, it's such a small cohort of students out in reporting on the students, you almost identify the students. But just to be aware that does take place within the district. Every year we have a very, very small cohort of students that actually participates in that type of assessment. The other state assessment that's administered every year is the access for ELL. ELL students are English language learner students. Those are students whose first language is other than English. So their English proficiency may not be as strong as their English-speaking peers who have English as a first language. So we have about 60 students in the district who are identified for ELL services. The fact that they're identified does not mean that the parents have to accept the services, but it does mean that we have to offer the services. And we are still obligated to assess those students to determine how they are doing in terms of their English language acquisition. The setup on that assessment is really, again, a digital platform that it's administered on, but the progression of ELL language development is very different than, say, reading language development. So again, you're starting with students that have limited conversational skills in English, but have very strong conversational skills perhaps in their native tongue. And our job is to kind of get them from conversational skills to academic language skills. And that progression takes place over a series of years with a number of these students. Almost all of these students are in our elementary grades. And I think that really speaks to the quality of the instruction that's provided by our ELL instructors, the supports that are provided to those students, that they're all graduated from that program almost before they get to middle school. So it's important for you to realize that too. Those students have a lot of assessment that occurs with them in the second half of the year. They end up having to take the access because that's required by the state, and they also have to take NJSLA. So again, those are students again that have a very different kind of assessment profile than students that are only taking NJSLA. All right. Just a reminder about performance levels, especially if you don't have students at these grade level bands. When we think about NJSLA, we're talking about 5 performance levels. 1 being not yet meeting grade level expectations, so that's the lowest possible level that a student can score in, and then 5 being exceeding grade level expectations. Remember that 4 and 5 means that typically a student has met the expectations for the grade level, so we think about that as passing in that grade level. Level 3 means they were very close. You know, that 1 question, 2 questions for some of those students could have been a difference between scoring in a level 3 and scoring in a level 4. So sometimes when we're looking at some of our summative information at grade levels, when we see changes in percentages from 1 year to the next year, when we look at just like a grade level course view, it's important to keep that in mind, that gradual kind of, you know, possibly 2 students or 3 students can have a big percentage change on some of our smaller cohorts of students and buildings. All right, now this slide, I know it's hard to see, but I'm sharing this with you especially for, I'll share this for math, and then I'll talk about math first, and then I'll talk about language arts. It's really important to recognize that this is the only comparison data that we have to other schools in the state right now. So Dr. Mingle talked about that eventually there's going to be a large data release by the state, and then, you know, it's going to take us some time to go through that to be able to make some comparison information. But I point this one out because, first off, math scores on the NJSLA and Park are historically lower than language arts scores. Just like when you see this chart for language arts, you'll notice that language arts scores tend to have just higher percentages of students at different levels. So it's important to kind of recognize that. The other thing that we tend to look at here, and this is something that just kind of stood out to me, is like when I look at math here, we saw some dips in different grade levels according to the state. And some of them aren't significant, but one that stood out to me was grade 6 math. That across the state we had a 3% drop in grade 6 math. And I'm bringing that to your attention because when I show you, again, and some of you have seen a report already, just our grade 6 math performance, it's one of those things that stood out to me. I can't make a judgment on some of the numbers that we're seeing, but when we start looking at trend information, we have to ask the question about whether it's a byproduct of the assessment design or if it's something else that's taking place instructionally. And I think we always want to be careful about the way that we're posing those questions and kind of how we're actually approaching some of the work and investigating that as well. All right. So this slide here talks about our trends from 17, 18 to 19. This again is looking at course progression. This isn't a cohort slide. This is actually looking at, you know, changes in the course performance for those students. So, you know, again, when you look at this level 1 bold right here is showing the performance for level 1 in 2019. And then you can see the 2 years prior to that in terms of percentages. So we had 1% of our students in grade 3 performing at level 1. We had 2% of our students in grade 3 performing at level 2. When we go over to levels 4 and 5, we see 52 and 30. So a fairly high percentage of our students doing fairly well on the assessment as well. The best column to look at here are these columns over here. So you'll note, like, I kind of colored some things in green here to kind of show what would be, you know, kind of a notable trend or a notable set of information. A lot of these numbers are in black because when something is 0 or a 1 or a 2% change, I tend to not really look at that as a remarkable change. But when we start seeing some information that gets above like 3, 4, 5%, it's just something we want to look at and be aware of. So most of the trend information here was fairly positive. Again, I point out that grade 6 information as being, something that stood out as -7% this past year. But again, when we compare to the state information, there was something going on in grade 6. So I think it's something that we have to just be aware of and look at carefully as we go forward and get additional information from the state. This again shows our trend information compared to the state information. So these levels over here are kind of looking at, again, the change in the state with respect to the percentages of students that either increased or decreased in that one level area. So you can see again, our changes tend to be in that 1 to 2% range, where in the state they had an increase across the state of about 3, sometimes a little bit more than 3% in certain areas. So an increase of students that were performing at that level. When we look over here at, again, levels 4 and 5 again, we can see that view a little bit differently. We see some changes also occurring in the state that are either more than ours or consistent with ours. So, that's important to keep in mind too in terms of context around the scoring of that. All right. So this information is again showing our percentages in comparison now to the state percentages at each level. And what I'll point out on this one again, and for the most part, and this is something I think that our teachers should be very proud of, our students work very hard on this, and it's something that stands out. Most, again, across the state, you're looking at level 1 of being about 8 to 9% of students performing at a level 1. In our district, that tends to, with the exception of grade 8, mathematics tends to be more at the 1 to 3% range. Same thing when we start looking over here, our percentages are much lower in levels 1 and 2. And I'm not suggesting at all that we shouldn't be focusing on reducing those numbers more. But it is something, again, context becomes very important with this. And it becomes very important to kind of look at our sets of information to the state, and then when we have it available to other districts as well. All right. So when we look over here at levels 4 and 5, we can see again just what our percentages are compared to the state in levels 4 and then at levels 5 as well. All right. Okay, so again, going through each one of these slides kind of in progression, you can see this is again our elementary grade performance. So we're looking at grade 3 here, each of our buildings, and then our district percentages. The number in parentheses here next to the percentage, so this larger number is the percentage. The number of parentheses next to that is the student count. And that becomes really important when you start thinking about how small the cohorts are in our elementary schools. Some of the cohort sizes are under 30. So when you look at a percentage of students here, you can see like at Mount Horeb, one student is 3% of that entire cohort. So when you look here and you say that, for Mount Horeb, they're at 87%, that's a great number, but if they had just 2 or 3 more students scoring at level 3 instead of level 4, that number would have dropped down to, closer to 77, 78%. So those small cohorts in terms of percentages end up with pretty big swings. One thing I'll notice we go through these slides for 3, 4, 5 when we do this for math and for language arts. There's no one school that's always in the lead in all areas. It kind of varies and kind of adjusts, and I think there's always considerations around, did we have, staffing changes that were occurring there? Were there some things that were taking place within the year that provided additional context to kind of explain maybe some anomalies in scoring? So I think it's always important to kind of think about the questions that these kind of scores and these kind of views generate, and then actually not drawing conclusions too quickly around them. So again, you can see our overall district performance at 82%. So that's again less influenced by just 1 or 2 students when we look at that view as well. This is grade 4. Again, each building's fairly tightly clustered here with respect to levels 4 and 5. Again, I think this is something that really is something that we should note is just how few students are scoring at levels 1 and 2. I think that really gets at the idea of intervention programs and the types of supports that we're providing within the district for students. And that's one of our goals, is to move as many students as we can into that level 3 over time and continue to have those kinds of efforts. This is level grade 5. Again, context becomes important here. We tend to have most of our scores clustered in the 70s. I would say with Woodland again, when we kind of look at Woodland, each student is worth about 2% of a total score on that. So again, that change here really last year from this year was more likely looking at the number of students at 3 and 4. So looking at that percentage again, and again, asking questions within context about was there something else that was occurring there that we want to take a look at with that group, okay? And then we look at grades 6, 7, 8. Again, I mentioned before that state trend in mathematics. That's something, again, that we want to look at with relative to grade 6. The context around this becomes really important. I don't know if most of you remember last year when I did the comparison data to the 25 or so districts that had very like profiles to Warren. Our language arts scores were much higher than our math scores last year, but our ranking in comparison to the other districts was much higher in math than it was in language arts. So even though we kind of had closer to like a 70 percentile total range in mathematics, we were, I think, the second top performing school in all the schools that we compared ourselves to. So I think, its context becomes really important when we're looking at these scores. Do you want to wait till questions at the end, or how do you want to do that?
However you feel, whatever you think is best.
I mean, it may get answered as we go through the presentation.
Let's
so
go to the end, and then.
Well, I mean, it's just, if you don't mind.
It's up to you. You're the board president.
I think it might be helpful. I mean, we had the benefit of your reviewing this with us in the curriculum committee. Might be helpful to explain the grade A number a little bit and the circumstances.
Yeah, grade 8, again, remember, for people in the audience that aren't familiar with this, grade 8, I shouldn't say most of our students. If we had 240 students last year in grade 8, we had about 70 that actually took grade 8 mathematics. 170 of them took either geometry or algebra. So what starts to happen with grade 8 is when we remove a lot of those students and have them go into this algebra cohort, a lot of the numbers here start to, again, just like in those other grade levels where you have a smaller cohort of students, become very much influenced by the percentage of 1 or 2 students with that. I think what's really important to keep in mind with this, and you'll see this when I look at cohort data as we go forward, I don't want to over-focus on grade 8 because I think it's a discussion about not grade 8 mathematics, it's a discussion about grade K through 8 mathematics. Because all of these students that are in grade 8 mathematics that are at that course, we've been, aware of and have been part of our math program all the way through. So it's just something, again, when we look at performance in grade 8 general math, to me that's not just a grade 8 issue where we look and say what has to happen in grade 8. It's really something where we say, what do we need to do in terms of making adjustments earlier on within the programming for those students. So I'll talk a little bit about when we look at cohort information, but I think thank you for pointing it out. So it's a really important point. The fact that we have nobody over here in exceeding expectations in grade 5 is actually something that is by design for the most part. Students that are exceeding expectations in grade 8 math should be taking algebra. That's what happens for those students. If they're already beyond the expectations of the grade 7, grade 8 math program, they should be in the high school placement for algebra and be taking the high school algebra course here rather than taking it at the high school. So that grade 8 set of data and information is something that I know always stands out, but it's something when you look at the state comparison on that, it's something that is actually a pretty consistent profile across the state with respect to how that looks. All right. Okay, so this chart is again showing some cohort information. This has been presented in a couple different formats prior to this presentation to the curriculum committee, but if you look again at passing in 2018, this was our grade 3 group, and then in grade 4, that went from 76% at levels 4 and 5 to 72%. When you look over here, going backwards for grade 5, this was 78% in grade 3, 76% in grade 4, 70% in grade 5, and you kind of see that pattern that's kind of emerging with that. I'll talk about this a little bit with respect to math instruction as a whole. We've had the same math program in place for the better part of about 8 years right now. And it is something, again, that we're looking at carefully right now because when we look at some of the math information with respect to trend information, I think that the context with that with respect to program review also becomes very evident as well. All right. This is just a slide just pointing out subgroup information. So with subgroups, typically if a subgroup is 20 or fewer students, we don't report it on this type of slide. Because again, it's kind of like when we're looking at those small cohorts of students, 1 or 2 students in a subgroup that's that small can dramatically influence the profile of that subgroup or the perceived profile of that subgroup. So all of these subgroups are, again, have enough students to kind of be reported as a subgroup. One thing that stood out to me was, again, when we look at math instruction, there's always a concern about how do our female students do in comparison to our male students. We're pretty tightly clustered with respect to overall performance of female students compared to overall performance of male students. And I thought that was something that was very notable that stood out to me looking at that information. But you can see, this information is reported by the state. When we look at the test setup that we do, we have to identify all of these different subgroups for students and look and say, did it have an IEP or didn't have an IEP? Were they ELL students or not ELL students? That type of thing. So it's just another lens or another view on some of that information about student performance as a whole. Our participation has been very strong every year. Any change in participation that you can see we have a decrease of 46 students from last year to this year is really a byproduct of declining enrollment. We had a big 8th grade group go out, smaller 8th grade group come in. We do get probably the most opt-outs, I would say, where parents contact us last minute in grade 8. Because we'll have a lot of students that are going to private schools, and the parents just feel like that assessment is not something that we're going to use in private school. So we do get a number of last-minute opt-outs that occur in a grade 8 level at times. But generally, our performance with respect to participation, is a testament to, I think, the district in terms of parents value this type of feedback, value this type of opportunity for students kind of moving forward, and recognize that it's part of the program with respect to the curriculum as well. So just an area of note, if you're a parent and you get a report, you get the ISR report that's generated for you, we also get district summary reports. And the summary reports are broken down into different areas. The 4 areas of the math summary reports are, at each building and each grade level, are major content, which is kind of looking at the standards which are the focus of work within a grade level, to say these are the standards, again, that we're going to zoom in on, that the students are supposed to master, that we want to be able to kind of really, really accentuate with instruction across the year. Then there's supporting content. So there's a set of standards, like if you think about like the color being for major content being green, like that has to happen. That has to occur. Supporting content's kind of like a yellow standard, where you're looking to say, like, this is a supporting content standard. It's something, again, that's going to support students in their success with the major content, but it's not a mastery standard yet. It's something, again, that certainly is explicitly taught, but it's not taught for mastery at that time. It may be taught for mastery the following year. And then we look at reasoning and modeling. So reasoning is, again, students' abilities to, really work their way through a problem, to kind of have an unfamiliar problem, come up with a solution strategy that's going to address the problem, and really demonstrate their thinking around that. So that may be demonstrating their thinking in mathematical terms, so actually doing the work itself, or having to actually record their thinking in writing. There's a lot of mathematical writing that occurs on a state assessment. Students are required to actually put text to explain thinking. And then there's the idea of modeling. So students being able to kind of look and apply different mathematical algorithms to address, maybe a creative solution to a problem. Now, people have very strong feelings about reasoning and modeling sometimes, because that's the type of thing that gets a little bit different. It's not just getting the answer; it's actually expressing the thinking of the answer. But the test design actually includes some very explicit work that students are supposed to do with regard to reasoning and modeling. And the standards have very, very explicit kind of items that require us to kind of look at that. When you look at the performance across the buildings, the trend that begins to emerge is that we are consistently stronger in the areas of major content and supporting content than we are in the areas of reasoning and modeling. And I only point that out just because that if there's room for kind of adjustments, like if one of the goals that we have, say, is to have a higher set of test scores in math, the way you kind of get at that is this idea around reasoning and modeling. So I think that's an area that we just have to be aware of as a board, because I think if we just focus on the score itself, sometimes we kind of forget about, like, how are we doing in some of those sub areas with that. All right. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing now with language arts. So it's going to be the same set of slides, just same progression. I'll try to go quickly through that again as you can kind of see that. But the same chart, remember I said to you before that math scores tended to be a bit lower and language arts scores on a whole are higher across the state. So that's something, again, when we look at our averages, the fact that our percentages are higher in language arts doesn't mean that we're necessarily doing a better job in language arts sometimes. It may mean that we're doing an equally good job, it's just the test is different. Right? So I think it's important to kind of recognize that too as we're going through that. You'll notice here, like when you look at some of these slides, from this year, which was Park, to this year, which was NJSLA, most grade levels were fairly steady. Like we didn't have like 3-point drops. If we had a point, it was like a 1-point drop. So that scoring interpretation from both assessments seemed to be fairly consistent as we kind of work through that. All right, so same set of information again. Right now, this is looking at our 2017, 18, 19 course administrations. When you kind of go through and you look at our level 1 again for 2019, you can see what our trend information was for level 1 for 2017 and 18. Same thing here for level 2 performance. This is our level 3 performance. Level 4 performance, level 5 performance. Again, as I talked about before, looking just at increases that might be seen as significant or remarkable, you can look and say most of our changes were 1 or 2% or 0%. We had a big increase in grade 5 last year at 11%, and then in grades 4 and 5 or 4 and 7, we had decreases of 4% each. So again, I don't know what that means yet until we get some context surrounding that with other districts as well. All right, so when we kind of look at that, but those are questions that we have when we kind of think about other districts and overall performance with that. All right, this slide again just shows the state trends with respect to the different levels and whether or not there was an increase or decrease across the state and kind of what happened in our district with respect to increases at each level kind of across the state. So levels 1 and 2, these were what we could see in terms of increases or decreases with respect to the percentages in those areas, and then in terms of levels 4 and 5. So same information, just a different view on that as well. All right. Again, this is always helpful, I think, to compare our percentages to the state's percentages. We would expect this, that our percentages would be much lower than the overall state percentages. But again, I think when you look at like level 1 and 2, at grade 3, we have 9% of our students that are at that level. The state has about 28 to 29% of their students at that level. So that is kind of a very large difference in terms of performance. And that's why those reports being released that allow us to make comparisons to more similar districts become really important for us. You can see, again, our performance overall compared to the state, levels 4 and 5 is also very, very strong. All right. So again, this begins to break it down just by building, looking at performance in each building, with the percentages and the student counts and parentheses around that. Again, I just point out like that difference in student performance, like at Mount Horeb, one student is about 3 to 4% of that grade level. So when you kind of look and say like Mount Horeb had an excellent score of 81%, if we look and say if they had a student going from a 4 to a 3, that drops them down to a 77%. It changes that profile in terms of the percentage very dramatically. So I think it's important to kind of keep that in context. The same thing is true of Woodland. Like Woodland is, one student is 3%. So they have a 68 here, but again, if we had 2 students that had scored, one item off, a level 4, that would have been a 74 and looked very different in terms of a percentage. So I think, looking at that information becomes really important with respect to the small cohort sizes there. This is level 4, grade 4. This is our grade 5. You can see like Woodland, had a lower number in one of the grade levels, but then their number is very high here at 92%. So, again, no one group is not higher all the time in one area. And then we look at 6, 7, 8. This number, interestingly, like when you look at grade 6 across the state, this tends to be like a lower percentage for 6th grade. Some of it's a function of the test, with respect to like what's the norm of that assessment at that level as opposed to grade 7 and grade 8. Not to take anything away from the performance at the grade 7 and 8 because it's always been very strong at those levels as well. All right, so, we look at our cohort information again, just kind of looking at some of our trends. We can see passing rates in 2019, passing rates for the same cohort in 2018. We had, changes in percentages that range from 2 to 6%, depending on that cohort. And, we can track back on this, multiple years for these students because we've been collecting that information. So again, I just note again, this was a somewhat different assessment this year, when we kind of look at that as well. All right. Okay, this is our subgroup information. I do note this right here. This is something that stood out to me was, the difference between female performance and male performance, being 86 and 73%. That's something that, I think for male students especially, speaks to the importance of just, having lots of opportunities to engage in text in school, because it's not something that, well, some of you have never been a middle school boy, but that's not their focus, kind of outside of school. So, and then you can see the percentages here, tend to be a little bit higher. And that's what I said before, like language arts tends to be a bit higher in terms of percentages than math does. And that's just kind of a function of the test of design, I believe. All right, our performance again was really strong, in terms of participation. And then just some areas of note for language arts. The language arts assessment is broken into two areas for reading and writing. The reading sub-areas are literary text, informational text, and vocabulary. And then the writing are written expression, so just coherence of ideas, being able to express ideas effectively, and then writing conventions. And writing conventions, another term for that is, grammar and syntax, with students. When we look at summary reports across the grades, 3 through 8, the two areas that we're strongest in, kind of consistently are reading information, so informational text, and writing conventions. The reading informational text makes sense because the shifts that we've made with curriculum, especially with the advent of Common Core and then also with even the revised New Jersey state standards, was a focus on informational reading. Because that was something that was absent from standards prior to 2011 and that time frame. So we've done a lot of very explicit work, very explicit teaching around informational text. What it kind of suggests to me is that, and this is kind of the work we're doing right now, is kind of recentering ourselves a little bit. So we're also making sure that we're providing those literary text experiences for students and making sure that we have a good balance in terms of the way that the programming and the instruction looks. The other thing that stands out is that writing conventions piece, because I'll hear a lot that, we don't teach grammar. Our students actually do really strong with writing conventions. We do teach grammar. We teach grammar in context, though. And we teach applied grammar with the idea that, a student doesn't necessarily have to be able to identify every preposition in a list, but they need to be able to use a preposition effectively. So I think, that gets into kind of, again, the coherence of the ideas for students and whether the grammar supports, the expression effectively for students. And that was something that stood out because that is an area that's actually, according to this metric, a strength that we have. There's really no consistent pattern in any of the schools in the other areas, though. So, that also kind of invites some discussion around that as well. And I think that that's been part of the ongoing work that we've been having around language arts instruction for the past few years. So just areas of note around professional development. Again, I think the board is very committed in terms of the support that's provided, the resources that are provided for professional development. We're very fortunate to be able to bring in consultants to work with our teachers. The literature around PD, really suggests that it should be embedded. It should not be like a pull-out, one-shot deal for students or for teachers. We're able to actually provide that where we have coaches coming in, working with our coaches side by side to be able to build our capacity to support teachers in the areas of language arts. So that's ongoing work that's been taking place. That balance of reading experiences for students is why I think we really feel strongly about the idea of independent reading time for students, having opportunities to actually engage in authentic text, having choice for students with text that's guided by teachers, and making sure that that's something that we can put in place with fidelity across the grades. Grade 2 and grade 1 teachers, like grade 2 is doing a lot of intense work across the year this year to begin to redesign part of their approaches to language arts, look at their curriculum very carefully, and the work this summer will be kind of, again, pulling all that together to have a revised grade 2 language arts curriculum. And then also they've been spending a lot of time talking about the types of strategies they use for teachers. for students. So the idea of like guided reading is an accelerated reading approach. Like you want to be able to bring students through more than a year's growth because a student might be behind, when they got to a grade level. That's not an appropriate approach to use for every student in the class, though. That's something that's appropriate to kind of close an achievement gap, as opposed to, again, something where, you're working with a student who's making the type of progression and progress that we want to take place. So that type of work and type of discussions have been taking place in language arts. In mathematics, as I reported last year to the curriculum committee, we've had a committee of teachers that have been meeting for over a year now, just exploring different math resources and different math programs. That's why we're piloting the Ready Math program, really grades K through 8. In the elementary grades, that's taking place in different grade levels kind of across the district. Here, all the 6-8 math teachers are working with the Ready Math program to evaluate it this year and look and say, is that a better core resource than the Big Ideas program that we've used in the past? And again, I would go back to the idea of reasoning and modeling again. Part of what our current programs that we use may not adequately address is that idea of reasoning and modeling, so we need to kind of look at programs that perhaps do a better job of that in terms of the core resource. iReady, the diagnostic here, which a lot of you will receive if you have students, well, you all do. You'll receive a report about the iReady diagnostic tomorrow, I believe. So that is a window where students take an adaptive assessment. The goal on that is to get information about students before spring. Like we do that in language arts really well. This is a tool we feel can actually help us do that better in mathematics. So as students are kind of working their way through that, we're getting reports relative to the standards now, and kind of tracking student growth kind of across the year. So that's something, again, that a lot of PD has focused on that in the early months of the school year and looking at how we kind of roll that out within the staff. iReady is kind of exclusive of Ready Math, even though they have the same names. They're the same publisher, but you can use iReady without necessarily using Ready Math. A lot of districts do that. They use that diagnostic because it's a really good diagnostic to get information at multiple points during the year about how students are progressing in certain areas. And then we have just continued work that we're doing in those areas. Intervention strategies become really important. All right, 2 more slides, I promise, then we're done. All right, the idea of LLI, leveled literacy intervention, is something we put in place about 3 years ago for our reading basic skill support. So if a student was actually below grade level performance in grades 2 or 3 or 4, we might identify a cohort of students in the building. They work with a reading specialist. That's a really intensive guided reading program that is designed to kind of accelerate students through different levels. So it's a very, very intensive approach for students that have been identified for that type of program. Foundations was something we put in place about 3 years ago. And Foundations is one of these programs. It's a very structured program, but the literature is really clear about early phonics instruction. And the literature is really clear about early reading instruction. Like you need to identify students and close reading gaps before 3rd grade. If you don't, then it's constantly an uphill battle with that. So both of these approaches are intended to kind of identify, students, but also provide supports for students. So Foundations, that phonics approach, was something that we felt we had to have more consistency with that to make sure that we were actually doing a multisensory approach for all students and working that through. We're looking at the nature of basic skills instruction in math right now. That's part of this kind of math review that we're doing because the way we do basic skills instruction in language arts is very different than the way we do it in math. And we need to kind of begin to evaluate that and kind of close that gap a little bit for ourselves. And then we just have, again, just really a focus on using formative assessments across the year rather than waiting until the end of the year to get an assessment look on students. So that's something that becomes really important. And then we've onboarded a number of digital resources this year to kind of support the ability to kind of differentiate certain materials for students better. The other thing I just want to point out, and I want to thank the board for this, because when you look at overall student achievement, and we talk a lot about the whole child approach, these areas here are kind of counterintuitive. Like when we focus on these areas, we actually end up, doing a great service to students and actually end up with increased test scores. It's a little counterintuitive. A lot of districts go to test prep route with this. But we know, like by having a very strong visual and performing arts program, that actually results in students, again, having experiences that allow them to kind of engage in school differently and promote, again, I think, a whole child feel about like who they are as students and who they are as people. And we know that those students that perform and participate in these kinds of programs do better on standardized tests, across the board. So I think your commitment to not over-evaluating and over-analyzing some of these scores is really important, and that's the way that you've always approached this in the past. But it also allows us to have discussions about these types of programming, which become very, very important. And also, I think, add to the culture of the school and the community itself. All right, so again, I think that's important to point out, just as an area of interest for everybody. Comparison reports we talked about, we'll do that once we get this big data dump by the state, and we have time to go through that. So we'll be able to provide some more detailed context for you, comparison to other districts. And then this year's testing, this is the last slide. Hang with me. We get to actually field test this year. So the state sent us a memo that basically said that you've been invited to field test, but we're not allowed to turn the invitation down, so we're field testing this year. That means like 2 years ago, last year, we went down to 2 units of language arts instruction. Well, now we're back up to 3 because we're field testing in grades 3 through 8. They will not tell you like which unit is the field test unit. So you kind of just have to say to teachers and to students and the community, we just have to do our best on all 3 of them. And look and say that we don't know which one is the field test item. So we are identified as a field test district this year. Our administration weeks, we're looking at grades 6, 7, 8 being the week of May 4th, grades 3, 4, and 5 being the week of May 11th, and then you can see we also do the science administration as well. So in the middle school, we kind of compress it into 1 week. We've done this different ways over the years. In the elementary grades, because of the additional science assessment for 5th grade, it goes into a 2nd week, where that Monday and Tuesday we just try to give the kids a break, and not make them double up on assessments as much at that level. All right, so that's the testing report.